Hello everyone, my name is Alice. Today we'll be looking at the Lost Omens Ancestry Guide by Paizo for Pathfinder 2e. I've done a couple of reviews before, but this is my first one doing it by myself, so go easy on me, but I'm excited to dive in. The Lost Omens Ancestry Guide is the latest in the Lost Omens line of Pathfinder 2e books, which tends to be more the lore-focused books as opposed to the core rulebook line. But this one could definitely straddle the line between the two. This is probably the most mechanically focused of the Lost Omens books we've had so far, in that almost every page has rules content, as it introduces a bunch of new ancestries and versatile heritages and expands on ones we've already had. So every uncommon ancestry that has already been published, so not the cores and not the Shuni, sorry Pug fans, have all got new feats, new heritages, new lore, all in this, while we also have a collection of new ancestries and versatile heritages that are introduced, which are the Android, the Aphorite, the Beast Kin, the Fletchling, the Fleshwarp, the Ganzi, the Genie Kin, the Kitsune, the Sprite, and the Strix. On the extended options, you will also note one that you might not recognise, which is the Azarketi, since these were supposed to have been introduced in Lost Omens Absalom, but since that book got delayed, you'll have to download the PDF that Paizo is putting out to actually see the core of these. Thankfully, I do appreciate they do call this out in the book and direct people towards the PDF, which I think is brilliant, because I know how easy it would be to be so confused and wonder where on earth you were supposed to know these from. Sadly, on this page, we also have the uncommon typo written out many times. This doesn't happen in the rest of the book, but it is very obvious on these pages, which is fairly amusing, and hopefully will get fixed in future volumes. But the rest of them you should recognize from the Advanced Player's Guide or from the Character Guide. And again, each of them does call out where you would have seen them before. I think most of this book does a really good job of making sure people know where to find their information. And so, if you're looking at something, you're like, oh, I don't know that. Be like, check the Advanced Player's Guide. A lot of the time, they'll just use simple tags next to like a prerequisite to do it, which I think is fantastic. I will say there are some exceptions to this. One of the things I found tricky was things like with some of the like Azamar and Dampier lineages. They reference things that haven't been published yet, which I think is a bit of a barrier to entry to new people who are picking this up. If you're picking this up and it says, oh, your ancestor was an Agathian, and I believe Agathians are coming out in Bestiary 3, but they're not out yet. So it relies on information you cannot access yet in 2e. And while there is a small bit in the glossary that at least does mention they're bestial, because that was one thing I was worried about, that people wouldn't know what the features of the Agathian are. I feel like it's definitely like it can be intimidating if you're a new player to come to this and be like, I'm supposed to know all this. So there's a couple of instances where I think it's a bit harsh to new players, but I think overall it does a really good job, either with sidebars or through tags and just general information to let people know where to get stuff and know what to do with it. So on the whole, it's good, but there are a couple of instances that like don't be upset if you don't know what it is, because there is a couple of information here that hasn't actually been published yet. But on the expanded ancestries, I think what we have got here is fantastic. I think one of the biggest things that this book helps you with the expanded ancestries is really contextualizing your character. Because, for instance, if you're playing a Tengu sailor and you're like, oh, I want to be, I was a Jinx feather Tengu who was on a ship. And then this book provides you some more information. One of the very sad things is it discussing how a fair few Tengus are press ganged as children because of their like worth on ships. So that's something you can be like, oh, was my Tengu press ganged? Or is that something people assume about them? Is that something they often are aware of with other Tengu? It immediately lets you ask more questions about your character and give them a place in the world. You often get like sidebars as well about different settlements that they exist in. Probably one of my favourite things in here as well, technically for one of the new ancestries, is talking about the Ulfin Beastkin and how they approach it, and stuff like that immediately just gives you ideas and helps you place your character in the world, helps them feel more grounded. And I think that's what the world building and lore does so fantastically in this book. For people who are only looking at the mechanics, if that's what you want, that's fair. But I will say, if you like a bit of lore, if you want some sort of inspiration, I'd really recommend checking out the lore sections because there's some fantastic um, stuff in here that really helps ground your character. I think one of my other favorite ones was the Shimted cat folk, who are the like lions, and they worship Bastet, who are one of Bastet's anathemas to get married. So they don't have a very like monogamous culture because that's not what's encouraged for them. So they have a very sort of nomadic, very polyamorous relationship where they sort of come and go. And that's like, I love looking at different family structures rather than the assumption that everything has the same nuclear family. So I really like how that's approached. Similarly, I adore what we got for orcs. Orcs so long in fantasy have been the generic big slightly racist Mongolian um ancestry, and it's so nice to see them actually being fully fleshed out, being treated as like an entire ancestry, having like different types of orcs. I'm so excited for the Matangi orcs, and I know we're getting more about them in the Wanky Expanse book later. But it's like, it does not make sense for the orcs in the Wangi Expanse who are fighting demons to have the same cultural context themselves, as well as have the way other people interact with them the same as the Belkzen orcs, and that's addressed and that's acknowledged in these books. It's like, no, there's not going to be the same thing. It mentions that they work well with the elves in the area because they have the same common enemy in the demons. A lot of people are quite happy to have big orcs helping them fight the demons. So there's a very different cultural context, and I'm really excited to learn more about them because what we already learned about them in this book and about their like communal war dances, I'm very excited about. And on that note, the art in this book is gorgeous, not just of the orcs, but of so many of the ancestries. The Tengu samurai with a gun is stunning. The Ganzi lady with the tail, the potato leshy, the art in this book, not only does it inspire many sort of characters, but it's just so evocative. And I also like how for a lot of the ancestries, they have something that's a bit more unexpected. So, for instance, for the Dampier, we have some very classic looking like vampire types for the Dampier. But then we have this Rushi, the Jiangxi Dampiers, and he's clearly like a lot sort of a very approachable man. And for those of you who know the lore, you can see that he is a Sukiyo worshipper. Which, and it's stuff like this that I really love as well with the art when we have these little Easter eggs. Because if you don't know the lore, this is still a beautiful piece of art, and there's still like, you can tell he's kind of a bit nicer than the one on the left. Like, he's got his little talisman, he looks more like a protector. But also, if you do know the lore and you know that he's a Sukiyo worshiper, and you're like, oh, of course, the Sukiyo worshipping Dampier makes sense because of his sort of outreach to sort of the marginalized on society and to the sort of people between life and death. So it makes a lot of sense, but you don't need to know that to appreciate the art. And it's that kind of thing that I really like. And we get this with a lot of the feat names as well. A lot of the feat names in this book are really good. Like, a lot of the android stuff is like really like revivification protocol, cleansing subroutine. It's all very sci-fi, which I really like. But probably one of my favorites in the book is the tiefling ability, where they can transform into other people. Is called Finest Trick, which again, if you don't know what that's referencing, is still a brilliant like name for a feat. You're like, oh yeah, my finest trick. But it's actually referencing the quote by Charles Baudelaire, the French poet, which is the devil's finest trick, convincing the world he doesn't exist, and you're disguising yourself as something that doesn't look devilish, which I really love. And for the new ancestries, there were definitely a couple of standouts to me. Androids got me a lot more than I expected. I'm definitely someone who's very like, oh, I like my fantasy. It's got to be like fantasy. And I'm not always big on like guns and sci-fi in my fantasy. But the way the androids are approached and the way they are integrated with the setting, the fact that we have like the android barbarians who've joined with the local Kelid tribes and everything, I'm actually like, I'm now determined to play an android. Like, they really captured me. I think the work that was done in the androids here is fantastic. They've completely like got rid of all my like fears. The fact that they were a rare ancestry is brilliant as well. So for those people who still like, no, I don't want androids in my game, you can just be like, well, they're rare, you can't play them. I think the way that rarity tags are used in this game and the way that they can be used by GMs to be like, no, you can't have that, and it's be supported by the text is so nice because it makes it seem like less of an asshole as well. And I really appreciate that kind of just really nice framework for GMs to be like, no, this is rare, you can't have that here. But if you're in Numeria, you might say, actually, here, this isn't rare, you can have that. And I think that's brilliant. Another one, or not one, a group that I liked more than I expected was the Genie Kin. Uh, I was always like, everyone likes a good elemental heritage, but I kind of didn't expect it to be more than that. And the way they're approaching this book, I think, is really fantastic and really helps. Like, we get all five Genie Kin as their own separate heritage. And I think it really helps you appreciate like the differences between them. Like, I love that the Undines have more of a culture, and they actually tend to like collect together near waterfronts because a lot of time they will be born in similar places, and how the feats for them aren't just all the same. Like the ones that are just the same, there's just a list of Genie Kin feats, so they don't have to repeat it 100 times, which is very good. But then they have their own. They all feel unique. They don't just feel like the fire one, the air one. Like the way that the like Oriads are more defensive and have like the ability to add their level to their shield block by fortifying it with stone. It doesn't just feel like, oh yeah, you summon a earth elemental, and they can do that as well. But there's like unique things they have, like the blazing aura of the Ifrits, where they can like explode around them, setting fire to all their enemies, whereas putting fire under the feet of their allies by quickening them, which is like I love. So I think the Genie Kin were a definite standout for me in this book. And with them and with the other versatile heritages, what I really appreciate in the art as well is that we actually get to see what it means to be a versatile heritage. It's not just like vaguely human looking. We have an Ifrit catfolk, we have a sylph gnome, we have an Asmar, sorry, not an Asmar, an Aphorite kobold, a Ganzi goblin. Is like it fully embraces what it means and what you can do by having versatile heritages. The Strix and the Beastkin are two of the more really new stuff that have been added that I'm very excited about as well. Um, for the Strix, like not only is the art beautiful and they sort of provide a way to get flight very early, which some people will be very excited about. But also just the lore for them is really lovely. There's a sidebar talking about their storytelling and lullabies and how they sing a song to their children about parasites that get into dirty feathers, which is so sweet. And it's exactly that kind of thing that really helps you like make them feel more real and really ground them in the world that I really love. But for those of you who are worried about flight, thankfully, yeah, it does go over in the book that, yeah, you don't get to start with flight generally on ancestries like the Strix or the Sprites, but there are ways to get it quite quickly. And if you're in a campaign where you're like, no, I'm letting them have flight by at level 1, it gives you advice on how to do that with the caveat that this is strong. But if you have a character idea that's like, it doesn't make sense for me not to be flying at level 1, like the idea is my character flew here, but I'm not gonna like overuse it, then there are ways to do that. Similarly for the tiny rules, because the sprites are our first tiny ancestry minus the pixies, there's rules on how to do that, and I love that we get the sidebar rules on riding PCs as well, because like people are gonna do this. They're like, yeah, I'm gonna sit on my friend's shoulder. I'm not gonna run around. Why do I need to? I can sit on my friend's shoulder. So I like that there's rules clarification for how to do that and what that means, because people are going to do it. And talking about the sprites, probably one of my favourite feats in this book is the Corgi Mount, which is their level 1 ability to get a familiar, a small familiar, that the Tiny Ancestry can ride that is a Corgi, because the back of the Corgi is often called the fairy saddle. And in Wales, the idea was that fairies would ride on corgis as their mounts. And I love this call out to actual fairy mythology, and I think this sort of adherence to mythology we also get to see with things like the Kitsune and with the Tengu. I feel like there's a lot more like respect given to the mythology of some of the creatures who do come from mythology in this book, and the like call outs to how they're historically shown. And I know James Case has done a lot of work on this for the Tengu and the Kitsune, and I don't know who brought in the Corgi Mount, but I think that it's really fantastic to see that, and it actually not being so like separated and almost cut off from where they come from, and actually like have them as this like fantasy ancestry but also acknowledge their mythology, which I think is really cool. For this next ancestry, I want to start with a quote, which is probably one of my favorite quotes by the poet Janice Lee, which is, draw a monster. Why is it a monster? And I love this because it makes you think about how we visualize monstrosity, and our idea of what a monster is so I tied up with our idea of different bodies. Because when most people draw a monster, they will draw something either non-human or a human who looks different from them. They will often draw on tropes subconsciously of um, racialized, the racialized other, the disabled other. They will draw on things that they don't recognize that seem scary to them as monstrous. And we see this all throughout history, and especially throughout fantasy. A lot of fantasy monsters rely on the idea of the other and the visual other, especially. And when the real idea is that a lot of monsters in the world look exactly like you, the idea of that you can draw a monster, that there is a look to a monster, is something that's always something that people need to stop and think about. And I think that's something that's prevalent in fantasy. And Paizo's not immune to this. Pathfinder does fall into this trap with things like Namashtu and the idea of deformity and monstrosity as evil, which is why I was really pleasantly surprised by the way the flesh warps are handled in this. In that there are people who have been transformed, who look visually what people would consider monsters, who in many ways draw on like disabled ideas, and they're just like, you're a kind of a normal person who got screwed over, and that doesn't mean you're evil. And it stresses that, yeah, most of the time you just want to live a normal life and be left alone. And the idea that because you now you have like spider legs growing out you from a failed dried experiment, you're now evil, is kind of silly. And I really like the thematic approach to that, and I think it's a really good step to just playing like, yeah, I look horrifying to people, but that doesn't mean I am horrifying. And we need to separate our ideas of what scares us visually from what is bad morally. And the idea that like scars are a mark of sin. How many villains do you see that have like scars? You see this a lot with like Bond films and superhero films, where things like scars and limps and breathing apparatus, like Darth Vader, is seen as like this scary thing that's their mark. And it's it's worrying for disabled people, and it's scary, and it's nice to see a deviation from that. My biggest problem with the flesh warps is I don't understand why they're an ancestry. They feel like they should have been a versatile heritage. Like, it does say that some of them are created while some of them are transformed, but I feel like you should maybe have separated the created ones. Everything about them, I'm like, well, what if I'm a gnome who's been transformed? I want to be a flesh warp gnome. If I'm an elf who's been transformed, I want to be a flesh warp elf. Whereas it sort of does the whole thing where in the versatile heritage is fixed, where it's like you're almost defaulting to human with it, and it doesn't assume you have everything else, which is very odd. Like, one of the things gives you dark vision and everything, although that is a feat rather than the core thing. It's like if you're an orc. So I do wish this was a versatile heritage. My main problem is mechanical with this, whereas I really like a lot of the lore and the way they approached it. But I really think this should have been a versatile heritage, and I'd love to know why they didn't do it as that. The new versatile heritages we did get, though, I especially love, yeah, the Ganzi and the Beastkin, as well as the Genie Kin, which I covered. The Aphorites didn't capture me much. I felt like it was tricky to work out what you wanted to do with them, how you conceptualize that. Whereas I think the Ganzi, they did the concept so well that it kind of stands out. But the Ganzi are fantastic. The way that like you get resistance, but you don't know which one you're going to get on the day, and you have to roll. And they have another feat as well. So for people who like sort of more chaotic characters and where the dice decide it a bit more, they're brilliant for that. As well as the art being absolutely beautiful. So I really like the really like, yeah, chaotic nature to their feats, and like your tail sort of like acting on its own and everything. Everything about how they are feels chaotic in a way that the Afrits didn't feel lawful. So I think the Ganzi are brilliant, and I definitely want to play a Ganzi character. Probably a Protean kin because she's beautiful. And the Beastkin, I know a lot of people are going to be very excited by. Again, art beautiful, and I really like both the feats, the fact that you like turn into like a small version of your animal early, even if you're usually a bigger animal. Like it mentions, you can turn into a tiny bear cub. So I'm definitely playing a werebear who turns into a tiny bear cub. And again, the lore on this about the elf and beastkin, which I mentioned, is fantastic. Both like this immediately wants me to make an elfin werebear, and when this really inspires me to make a character, that's when these books are really succeeding. Because yeah, the lore they give about like how the elfin approach not just like beastkin and sort of non-violent werefolk, but how they approach were creatures who can't deal with the curse, and how they actually sort of accommodate for them in their society because they value sort of the ferocity of were creatures so much. I think was really cool. So I really liked, like, that's probably one of my favorite sidebars in the book. I just think it's so cool. I realized I forgot to mention earlier, but with the like religious art characters as well. I love that we have an Erasni Duskwalker. I have an Erasni Duskwalker planned, and I adore Erasni. Anyone who's seen like the posts on Reddit about Erasni, it's probably me. So the fact that we actually get an Erasni Duskwalker in here is fantastic. I think it really makes sense, and that was really lovely to see. That really touched me. And I think it makes a lot of sense as a character who's been brought back, possibly against their will as well, to worship Erasni. So it really fits in. So I was really happy to see that. Another thing that's really fantastic to see in the art is how much like explicitly non-white art we have in this book. Like with the fetchlings, the fact that it's not just all like pale white women, like we actually have black fetchlings, we have black Genie Kin, we have like an Undyne, the water Genie Kin based on Hawaiian culture, and it's really helps you feel like, yeah, everyone is welcome in these books. And I think this is something they're doing a lot more work on in Pathfinder, and I think it's really good to see. And it was good to see a lot of with the actual artists as well. I noticed there were like Korean and Vietnamese artists, and it's not just like white artists drawing characters of color. We actually have a variety of artists. I know with the writers as well, and especially with the upcoming Rank Expanse book, they're actually trying to get a lot more people behind the screen as well who are involved, who are actually people of color, and that's really good to see. And yeah, it's a nice step forward in fantasy, which has often been such a white domain. But no, overall, I think, yeah, this book is absolutely fantastic. The art is beautiful, the lore is brilliant, the new feats are fantastic as well. I've already mentioned a couple of my favorites, but like I love that we get like a hopping thing for the Jiangshi, because then there's the hopping vampires, so we actually get a feat where you can hop. Like there's so much really evocative stuff in here, and some pretty powerful stuff for those who like power gaming. But no, and I think this is definitely worth getting. I know a lot of people ask like which Lost Omens books should I get, especially if I'm not somebody who's big on the lore. And this is going to be a must-have because not only is it fantastic lore-wise, but the mechanics it presents, your table's going to want this. And again, even if you're not somebody who's big on Galarian, the ideas that this can give you for a character, like even if you want to use it for something else, like the idea of the desert orcs living under the sand, and like having all their like civilizations just under to hide from the sun, that's something you could be like, oh, elves do that in my world, just for your home campaign. And I think there's so many ideas you can draw from in here that like I have to recommend this one if you're looking for a book. So no, I hope everyone enjoys it, and I'll see you all for the next one.